Hi, this is Ms. Shervin again, and we are doing lesson 16 on genes. And this is a guided instruction video found on page 88. Please remember you can pause and rewind at any point that you think necessary. So, the I can statement for this chapter is you can understand how inherited traits are passed on from parents to offspring. So inherited means that it comes from your parents if you're inheriting something, and if somebody else or some other organism inherits something from their parents, it means that they got it before they were born in biology. And a trait is a characteristic. Human traits can include stuff like hair color, eye color, height, disposition to different diseases. And the word offspring, remember, are referring to baby or children. So at the end of this chapter, you should be able to understand how traits are passed on from parents to offspring. And this chapter has some extensive vocab. It includes genes, DNA, chromosome, and alleles. And before I actually get involved with just the starting the reading, I'm going to do a little bit extra review to help you throughout this. As you may recall, we talked about DNA. DNA is this double helix. The structure of it is a double helix. It has certain base pairs. Remember, A pairs with T, C pairs with G. And this DNA can be tightly wound up like a ball of yarn into a chromosome. And we can find the chromosome in the nucleus of a cell. Remember that we and all living things are made of cells. At each side of cell, there is the nucleus, the center, and it's the command center because it contains the DNA, because it contains the chromosomes. So DNA and chromosomes are the same thing, only DNA is that double helix strand. So when we talk about DNA, we're talking about the double helix form. And a chromosome is when that DNA is wound up into a tightly packaged chromosome. So if we just look at this for a second, we talk about genes. Remember that genes code for a specific trait. And genes are also a specific portion of the DNA strand. It can just be a part of it, like this right here. This could be a location of one gene, this could be a location of another gene. And these genes are also found at a specific location on the chromosome. Now, let's take a second and consider another analogy to help us out. Here we have a strand of yarn. It is what I would say is like the DNA. And each little different color that we have on the, for example, like this portion right here, could be analogous to a gene. And the other colors, or color in this case, would also be a different gene. Now, when you wind it all up, you get a ball of yarn, and if this was a actual DNA strand, this would be like the chromosome. Okay? And just like we can see the gene on the DNA, we can also see the gene in the chromosomes. Now, just like we saw the genes in our spool of yarn, right? We saw the gene here and the gene here. And we talked about how there's different colored genes. Well, or different types of genes. Everybody has the same gene that could code for a specific trait, but they have different types. So for example, if this was a gene for eye color, and these were two different people, you would find the same gene in the same location of the chromosome, but one person might have a gene for blue eyes, while the other might have a gene for brown eyes. And the different types of genes are called alleles. It's like if, for example, genes were ice cream, The alleles will be all the different flavors. They're still all ice cream, but there's different types. Now, we can have many different types. Get rid of this one for a second. So, we get a different type of allele from each one of our parents. Sometimes they happen to code the same, sometimes they happen to code different. And they're also found in the same portion of the chromosome. Now, in sexual reproduction, we get half of our genes from Pa and half of our genes from Ma. In our sex cells, we only have 50% of the DNA that is needed to make a whole organism. The other sex has the other 50%, and when they come together during fertilization, that's when we have created a full set of DNA. So in our body cells, we have twice the amount of DNA as we do in our sex cells. Now I think we're really ready to read our definitions and to go on with our reading. So I'm back on these pages, on page 88. Genes are tiny segments of DNA molecules that carry out the instructions for inherited traits. A long molecule of DNA stores the genetic information of an organism. A chromosome is a tightly bundled molecule of DNA, and different forms of the same gene are called alleles. And I'm going to read the directions because I need practice making sure I do them. So I read them all the time, even if I don't think they're necessary or know them. It's a good habit, so when it does come time and I do need to read directions, I do it. Directions. Read the following information. Alright. Inside the nucleus of every cell in your body is a complete set of coded instructions. So the nucleus is inside our cell right here. These instructions are for building another human being identical to you. Unless you have an identical twin, no one else has instructions exactly like you. These instructions determine whether you will have straight hair or curly hair, brown eyes or blue eyes. The instructions for these traits come from your mother and your father. So there's a lot in that paragraph. So what they mean by these instructions are for building another human being identical to you is that if you took the DNA that you have inside you and somebody else all of a sudden just got your DNA from some magical process, they would become you. They would be you. This is what we're trying to do, cloning, and we have been successful. We have successfully cloned other animals. The first one was a sheep named Dolly. Now, they also said that it determines what kind of traits you have, true, and that the traits are inherited from your mother and father. All right, next paragraph. These instructions for individual traits are supplied by genes. Remember, locate specific parts of DNA. Each gene carries a single instruction. Genes are tiny segments for very long DNA molecules. These molecules are tightly coiled and bundled up into structures called chromosomes. Most human cells have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes in all. Inside the nuclei, lined up along each chromosome, are thousands of genes. It is estimated that the human body contains 35,000 different genes. Wow. So basically what they did is they described here, the picture, they talked about a gene-specific portion of that long DNA molecule, which is wound up into a chromosome, which are found inside the nucleus of a cell. Humans have 23 pairs, or 46 in all. Not every animal has the same amount of chromosomes. And here's an important note that they didn't touch on completely, but I think it is really helpful for your upcoming questions. Body cells have pairs of chromosomes. Sex cells, like the sperm and egg, have a single set of chromosomes. This means that sex cells have half the amount of chromosomes compared to body cells. Alright, and this I thought was a very important diagram, but I also thought this portion of the reading from instructions to the definition of chromosomes was very helpful. Instead of underlining it all, I just put a nice little side mark so I remember that portion's important. I'm going to read this portion on the side because I think it might be helpful before I read that paragraph. Information systems. Computer records of a person's genetic makeup may help doctors fight possible future inherited diseases. However, theft or misuse of such records may result in discrimination. Interesting. Alright, now for the reading. Like chromosomes, most genes come in pairs. An individual has 2 copies of each gene, one inherited from the mother and one inherited from the father. If you remember, here is what they're talking about with one set from mom and one set from pa. And during reproduction, they get together and they're combined with a protein called a centromere, and that's when they start looking like an X. These copies are not always identical. Different forms of a gene are called alleles. A particular trait can be determined by a single pair of genes or by many pairs of genes. A simple trait, such as whether or not a person has dimples, can be controlled by a single pair of genes. Traits that can occur over a wide range, such as height and skin color, are more complicated. There are many different heights and skin colors seen in humans. These traits are usually determined by the instructions from many pairs of genes. So this paragraph I found was very helpful. And I thought particularly the beginning, but again, I don't want to highlight everything. I found that when it tells me that the individual has 2 copies of each gene was important, that comes from mom and dad, and that different types of the genes are called alleles. So I put a nice line by the side. Okay, now we're ready to go over our guided questions. The first question asks, what are genes? I can go back here and I can find that genes are instructions for individual traits. And I read and learned a little bit more about them as well. So I put, genes are segments of DNA, each with a single instruction for a trait. And remember, this is going right here. There's not much room for me to write it, so make sure I know that's where that goes. Alright, the next thing it asks me are, what are located on DNA molecules? Well, on the DNA molecules, we can find genes. Again, not a lot of space to write it, so I'm just going to write genes. Okay. How are chromosomes related to genes? Well, you know that you can find chromosomes in the nucleus, but that's not what they're talking about with genes. We know that they're made up of DNA, but we also know that on the DNA, you can find genes, and also you can find them on the chromosome. So I put, chromosomes are structures within a cell that contain genes. So chromosomes have the genes located on them, and that they're located in the cell. I should even be more specific. Within the cells, let's say cell's nucleus, because I'm pretty sure that's important. And our last guided question is, what is an allele? Remember, alleles are different types of each gene. And so I wrote, alleles are different forms of genes. Okay, this brings us to the portion that helps us with our terminology on the upcoming questions. So the first thing I just want to talk about is, what is the relationship? So when a question asks you what's the relationship, like in number 1, there's a few others, but it's asking how the 2 different things, or more than one thing, work together, interact, or are related. You can have positive, negative, relationships can have many different types, but they're asking about, like, how are they related to one another? Number 2 asks about blueprints of a house. If you haven't seen blueprints of a house, it's called blueprints because for a long time we've actually used blue paper. It's instructions on how to carry out and build a house. And then number 4 talks about a teacher providing a model of chromosomes where they use beads and string, and I just wanted to show you what that might look like. And that is all. Please remember to like this video if you found it helpful, so I know and I continue to make them. Thank you.